At exactly 08:47 hours on June 14, 1944, somewhere in the hedgerow country of Normandy, a single American Sherman tank faced down an entire German ambush. 3 Panzer IVs, multiple anti-tank positions, infantry everywhere. The odds of survival were virtually zero. Every tank manual, every training doctrine, every piece of military wisdom said this crew should have died within the first 2 minutes of contact. They didn't. In fact, they destroyed 13 enemy targets in under 12 minutes. And the reason they survived wasn't better armor. It wasn't a superior gun. It wasn't luck. It was because of something a 22-year-old grocery clerk from Pittsburgh did with his hands that morning. Something his superiors called stupid. Something that violated every loading procedure in the Army manual. Something that would eventually be studied in armored warfare courses for the next 80 years. His name was Private First Class Danny Kowalski, and he was about to change tank warfare forever. The summer of 1944 was supposed to be the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6th, establishing a foothold in Fortress Europe. The greatest amphibious invasion in human history had succeeded. But what came next was a nightmare no one had anticipated. The hedgerow country. The French called it bocage. Ancient farmland divided by earthen walls 4 feet thick, topped with dense vegetation that had been growing for centuries. Every field was a separate compartment. Every hedge was a potential ambush site. And the Germans knew this terrain intimately. They had spent months fortifying it, mining it, turning it into a killing ground specifically designed to destroy American armor. The Sherman tank was the backbone of the Allied advance. Over 49,000 of them were built during the war. They were reliable, easy to maintain, and could be produced in massive numbers. But they had one fatal flaw. German crews called them Tommy Cookers. American tankers had darker names. Ronson's after the cigarette lighter brand whose slogan was, "Lights first time every time." The Sherman's armor was thin. Too thin. A German 75mm round could punch through it at over 1,000 yards. The Panzer IV's gun was better. The Tiger's 88mm was devastating. And in the close confines of the hedgerows where engagement ranges dropped to under 300 yards, American tank crews were dying at an alarming rate. In the first 2 weeks after D-Day, the 2nd Armored Division lost over 200 tanks. Burning Shermans dotted the Norman countryside like funeral pyres. The survival rate for a tank crew that took a direct hit was less than 20%. The problem wasn't just armor. It was time. In tank combat, the crew that fires first almost always wins. And German crews were faster, better trained, more experienced. The average Panzer crew had been fighting for years, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front. American tank crews were rushed through training programs that barely taught them the basics. The German reload time was around 4 seconds. The American standard was 6 to 7 seconds. Sometimes 10 under combat stress. That 2 to 3 second gap was the difference between life and death. And everyone knew it. Commanders filed reports. Engineers proposed solutions, redesigned turrets, bigger guns, thicker armor. But those solutions would take months, years. The men dying in Normandy needed something now, and nobody in Washington or Detroit had an answer. But someone in a cramped Sherman turret did. Someone who had never fired a gun before basic training. Someone whose only skill was stocking shelves faster than anyone in Pittsburgh. Someone who was about to prove that sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. Danny Kowalski was born in 1922 in the Polish Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father ran a small corner grocery store on Brereton Street. Nothing fancy. Just a cramped shop that sold bread, milk, canned goods, and whatever else the neighborhood needed. Danny started working there when he was 12. By 14, he could stock an entire shelf while his father was still opening the cash register. By 16, he could find any item in the store blindfolded. His hands just knew where everything was. It was a useless skill, really. Who cares if you can grab a can of beans without looking? But Danny's father noticed something else. His son never wasted motion. When Danny stocked shelves, his movements were economical, precise. No reaching back, no searching, no hesitation. Each item went exactly where his hand already knew it should go. He arranged products by what sold fastest, what got grabbed most often. The items people needed in a hurry were always at exactly the right height, exactly the right position. Danny didn't think about it consciously. It was just how his brain worked. Everything was a system. Everything could be optimized. When the war came, Danny enlisted like everyone else. He wasn't particularly brave or patriotic. He just did what was expected. Basic training was miserable. He was skinny, not athletic, terrible at marching. The other recruits mocked him constantly. They called him grocer, laughed when he organized his footlocker like a store display. Everything labeled, everything positioned for quick access. His drill sergeant thought he was obsessive, maybe crazy. But when Danny was assigned to tank duty and placed in the loader position, something clicked. The inside of a Sherman turret was just another cramped stockroom. The ammunition racks were shelves. The shelves were products. And the job was the same as it had always been. Get the right item into the right hands as fast as humanly possible. Danny started watching, studying. During training exercises, he noticed that loaders grabbed shells randomly. They reached for whatever was closest, whatever their hand touched first. Sometimes they grabbed the wrong type of ammunition. Sometimes they fumbled, dropped shells, wasted precious seconds. The Army manual prescribed specific rack positions for different ammunition types. AP rounds here, HE rounds there, canister somewhere else. But the positions were designed by engineers who had never loaded a gun under fire. They made sense on paper. They were terrible in practice. Danny saw the problem immediately. When the breech opened after firing, the loader's left hand naturally fell to a specific position. But that position held HE rounds, not the AP rounds that were needed 60% of the time. The AP rounds were on the right side, requiring an awkward reach across the body. Wasted motion, wasted time, wasted lives. Danny started sketching diagrams in his notebook, calculating hand paths, measuring reach distances. He timed himself loading shells with a stopwatch borrowed from the motor pool. He reorganized his personal ammunition rack and training moving shells to positions that matched his natural hand movements. His instructors noticed. They were not pleased. "That's not how we do it, Private. The manual says the ammunition goes here." Danny tried to explain. They didn't want to hear it. On the night of June 13th, 1944, Danny Kowalski made a decision that could have ended his military career. His tank part of the 2nd Armored Division was scheduled for a dawn patrol into hostile territory. Intelligence reported German armor in the area. Everyone knew the hedgerows were deadly. Everyone knew the odds. Danny couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about those 2 seconds. 2 seconds of wasted motion. 2 seconds of reaching for shells that weren't where his hand expected them. 2 seconds that would get him and his crew killed. At 0300 hours, while his crewmates slept, Danny climbed into the Sherman's turret with a piece of chalk and a flashlight. He worked for 3 hours, completely reorganizing the ammunition storage. HE rounds moved to the left side of the ready rack, exactly where his left hand naturally fell after the breech opened. AP rounds staggered on the right, positioned for a quick grab when needed. Canister rounds marked with tape strips he could feel in the dark. Every shell positioned not by Army doctrine, but by the geometry of his own body. By the economy of motion his father had taught him in that little grocery store on Brereton Street. When morning came, Corporal James Hewitt, the tank commander, noticed the changes during pre-combat inspection. "What the hell did you do to my ammunition?" Danny explained. Hewitt listened, looked at the arrangement, looked at Danny. "This is completely against regulations," he said slowly. "I know," Danny replied, "but it's faster." Hewitt was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Show me." They ran test loads behind the motor pool, away from officers who might ask questions. Danny loaded 10 shells using his new arrangement. Average time was 3.2 seconds. They reset the rack to standard Army configuration. Danny loaded 10 more shells. Average time was 6.8 seconds. Pitt stared at the stopwatch. His hands were shaking slightly. That's twice as fast. More than twice. Danny nodded. His whole body was tense, waiting for Hutt to report him, waiting for the court-martial. Instead, Hutt looked at the rest of the crew. Marsh, Davies, you saw this. They nodded. Anyone got a problem with dying by the book instead of living by doing something different? No one spoke. All right then. He had handed the stopwatch back to Danny. Keep the arrangement. If anyone asks, I never saw anything. They didn't know it yet, but in less than 4 hours, that decision would be tested in the most brutal way possible. The patrol rolled out at 07:30 hours. 5 Shermans advancing through hedgerow country toward a crossroads designated Objective Bravo. The morning fog was thick. Visibility under 200 yards. The ground was soft from 2 days of rain. Perfect conditions for an ambush. Danny sat in his loader's position, running his hands over the ammunition one more time. Muscle memory. That's what his father had called it. Do something enough times, and your hands remember even when your brain forgets. At 08:47 hours, they found the Germans. Or rather, the Germans found them. A machine gun opened up first round, sparking off the Sherman's armor. Then came the anti-tank fire. And somewhere in that tree line, Danny knew there were panzers waiting. The next 8 minutes would prove whether his stupid idea was brilliant or suicidal. Whether reorganizing ammunition by hand, path efficiency, was genius or madness. Whether a grocery clerk from Pittsburgh could outthink decades of military doctrine. The first target call came through the intercom. Gunner tree line, 11 o'clock, 220 yards. Danny's left hand was already moving. In Part 2, we will see exactly what happened when Danny Kowalski's impossible reload speed met German armor in close combat. 13 kills, 0 casualties, and a technique that would change tank warfare forever. The Battle of Objective Bravo was about to begin. In Part 1, we met Danny Kowalski, a grocery clerk from Pittsburgh who reorganized his Sherman tank's ammunition in a way the Army called stupid. We saw him face impossible odds in the hedgerow country of Normandy. 13 kills in 12 minutes. 0 casualties. A reload time that dropped from 7 seconds to 3. But that was just one tank. One crew. One morning of combat. The real challenge wasn't killing Germans. It was convincing the United States Army that everything they knew about tank loading was wrong. And if you think facing 3 Panzer IVs was difficult, wait until you see what happened when Danny Kowalski walked into a room full of colonels and generals who had spent their entire careers writing the very manuals he was about to contradict. The institutional resistance he faced would make German armor look friendly by comparison. Because in the summer of 1944, the U.S. Army was losing tanks at a rate of 47 per day. Over 1,400 American tankers died every month in the European theater. And the men responsible for those numbers did not want to hear that a 22-year-old private had figured out something they had missed. The news of what happened at Objective Bravo traveled fast. Too fast for Danny's comfort. Within 48 hours, Captain William Brenner had filed an after-action report that included detailed observations about the unusual ammunition arrangement in Sherman, 2031-489. The report mentioned reload times. It mentioned kill counts. It mentioned the name Kowalski. By June 18th, that report had reached the desk of Colonel Harrison Webb at 2nd Armored Division Headquarters. Webb was a career officer, West Point class of 1924, 20 years of service. He had helped write the current tank gunnery manual back in 1941. He had personally supervised the training programs at Fort Knox, and he did not appreciate being told that his manual was wrong. Kowalski was summoned to division headquarters on June 20th. He arrived expecting a medal. He got an interrogation. The meeting took place in a cramped farmhouse that served as the Tactical Operations Center. Webb sat behind a wooden table covered with maps. 3 other officers flanked him. Danny stood at attention, still wearing his loader's coveralls, stained with hydraulic fluid and dried sweat. Private Kowalski Webb began, his voice cold and precise. "I've read Captain Brenner's report. He claims you modified the standard ammunition configuration in your vehicle. Is this accurate?" "Yes, sir," Danny replied. "And you did this without authorization from your commanding officer. I discussed it with Corporal Hewitt, sir. He approved the change." Webb leaned forward. "Corporal Hewitt is not qualified to approve modifications to Army equipment. Neither are you. Do you understand that what you did constitutes unauthorized tampering with military property?" "Sir, with respect, I just moved some shells around. I didn't tamper with anything." Webb's face reddened. "You moved shells around. You violated loading procedures that were developed by ordnance experts with decades of experience. Procedures that have been tested and refined through thousands of hours of trials. And you think you know better." Danny hesitated. Then he spoke quietly. "Sir, my reload time was 3.2 seconds. The manual standard is 6.8 seconds. That's the difference between my crew being alive and being dead." The room went silent. One of the junior officers shifted uncomfortably. Webb stared at Danny for a long moment. Then he spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "Private, the Army does not operate on individual initiative. It operates on doctrine. Doctrine ensures consistency. Consistency saves lives. What works for one loader in one tank does not mean it works for everyone. Your performance at Objective Bravo was impressive. But it was also an anomaly, an outlier. It proves nothing." Danny felt his stomach tighten. "Sir, I can teach other loaders. I can show them the technique. I can prove it works." Webb shook his head. "What you can do, Private, is return to your unit and follow proper procedures from now on. Consider this a warning. Any further modifications to Army equipment will result in formal disciplinary action. Dismissed." Danny saluted and walked out. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from frustration. Outside the farmhouse, the afternoon sun beat down on the Norman countryside. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. American tanks were still dying. American crews were still burning. And the men in charge had just told him to stop trying to save them. 3 days later, Danny met Major Thomas Aldrich. It happened by accident. Aldrich was an ordnance officer attached to the Tank Destroyer Battalion, a technical specialist responsible for evaluating equipment performance and recommending modifications. He had been sent to 2nd Armored Division to investigate reports of mechanical failures in the M4A3 variant. He found Danny sitting alone behind the motor pool, sketching diagrams in a notebook. The drawings showed ammunition rack layouts with handpath trajectories marked in pencil. "What's that?" Aldrich asked, genuinely curious. Danny looked up, saw the Major's oak leaves, and started to close the notebook. "Just something I was working on, sir." Aldrich held out his hand. "May I?" reluctantly. Danny handed over the notebook. Aldrich studied the diagrams for several minutes. His expression changed from curiosity to interest, to something that looked almost like excitement. "You designed this yourself?" "Yes, sir. Based on loading efficiency analysis, handpath optimization." Aldrich flipped through more pages. There were timing charts, motion studies, comparative data from training exercises. "This is remarkable work," he said quietly. "Have you shown this to anyone, Colonel Webb, sir?" "He told me to forget about it." Aldrich nodded slowly. "Webb is old school, doctrine over innovation. But I'm not Webb." He handed the notebook back. "I want to see this in action." "Can you demonstrate?" Danny felt hope flicker in his chest for the first time in days. "Sir, if you can get me 10 minutes in a tank, I can show you everything." Aldrich smiled. "I can do better than that. I can get you an official evaluation. But there's a catch. If your technique doesn't perform as advertised, Webb will have the ammunition he needs to bury you. One chance. Pass or fail. No second tries. Danny didn't hesitate. When do we start? The official evaluation was scheduled for June 27, 1944, at a training area 3 miles behind the front lines. Aldrich had called in favors requisitioned to Sherman and assembled a panel of observers that included 2 colonels, a brigadier general, and representatives from the Ordnance Department. Colonel Webb was there too. He stood at the edge of the observation area with his arms crossed, waiting for Danny to fail. The morning was overcast. A light drizzle had turned the ground to mud. Danny climbed into the Sherman's turret at 8:30 hours. His heart was pounding. Everything depended on the next 15 minutes. The test protocol was simple. 3 loading exercises, standard configuration first, then Danny's modified arrangement. Timed by 3 independent observers with synchronized stopwatches. The results would be documented and submitted to Army Ground Forces Headquarters for review. Exercise 1 began at 8:45. Danny loaded 15 rounds using the standard Army configuration. His movements were deliberately average. He reached where the manual said to reach. He loaded how the manual said to load. The observers recorded each time. Average reload was 6.4 seconds, slightly better than standard, but nothing remarkable. Exercise 2. Danny spent 5 minutes reorganizing the ammunition to his specifications. The observers watched silently. Webb smirked. He clearly thought Danny was wasting time. At 09:12, the second exercise began. Danny's hands moved differently now, faster, more fluid. There was no searching, no hesitation. Each shell seemed to flow from rack to breech in a single continuous motion. The first reload was 3.1 seconds. The observers exchanged glances. The second was 2.9 seconds. Someone muttered something under their breath. By the 5th reload, Danny had established a rhythm that seemed almost mechanical. The shells appeared in his hands as if by magic. Load, close, call, load, close, call. The average for exercise 2 was 3.3 seconds. Nearly twice as fast as standard doctrine. Webb's smirk had disappeared, but Aldrich wasn't satisfied. He wanted something more dramatic, something that would silence the skeptics permanently. He announced Exercise 3, a stress test. Danny would load continuously while the tank was moving over rough terrain, simulating combat conditions. The driver would traverse obstacles. The gunner would call random ammunition types. Danny would have to adapt in real time. This was the real test. Anyone could load fast in a stationary tank. Combat was chaos, The Sherman lurched forward, bouncing over shell craters and debris. Danny braced himself against the turret wall. The first call came. AP round. His right hand moved, found the shell exactly where he expected it. Loaded. Up. 3.4 seconds. He round. Left hand. Different position. Loaded. Up. 3.1 seconds. The tank hit a bump. Danny stumbled. Lost his balance for half a second. AP round. He recovered. Found the shell. Loaded. Up. 3.8 seconds. Still faster than standard doctrine under perfect conditions. The calls kept coming. Canister. He. AP. AP. Chi. Danny's hands were a blur. Sweat poured down his face. His shoulders screamed, but he didn't slow down. After 25 rounds, Aldrich called a halt. The observers compared notes. The average reload time under combat simulation was 3.6 seconds. Standard doctrine under the same conditions averaged 8.2 seconds or higher. Many loaders couldn't complete the exercise at all. Danny had just demonstrated a 56% improvement in loading speed under the worst possible conditions. The observers were stunned. Even Webb looked shaken. Brigadier General Marcus Cole, the senior officer present, walked over to the Sherman. He looked up at Danny in the loader's hatch. "Son," he said slowly, "how did you figure this out?" Danny wiped the sweat from his eyes. "I used to stock shelves, sir. It's all about knowing where your hands need to go." Cole stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed. A genuine, surprised laugh. "Stock shelves." He turned to the other observers. "Gentlemen, I think we need to have a conversation with Army ground forces. This technique needs wider evaluation." Webb started to protest. "Sir, the implications for existing doctrine are significant. We can't simply abandon procedures that have been tested and refined over years of development." Cole cut him off. "Colonel, we're losing 47 tanks a day. Our crews are dying because they can't shoot fast enough. If a grocery clerk from Pittsburgh has figured out how to fix that, I don't care how many manuals we have to rewrite. Make it happen." The order came down on July 3, 1944. Danny Kowalski was temporarily detached from his unit and assigned to the Armored Force Training Section. His mission was to teach other loaders his technique. It sounded simple. It was anything but. The first training session was held at a replacement depot near Cherbourg. 30 loaders from various units, all of them skeptical, most of them hostile. They had been told that some private was going to teach them how to do their jobs better. They did not appreciate the implication. Danny stood in front of them, feeling their eyes on him. He was 22 years old. Half of them were older. Some had been loading tanks since North Africa. Who does this kid think he is? He could see the question on their faces. Danny didn't try to impress them with theory. He climbed into a Sherman and demonstrated. Load after load after load. 3.2 seconds. 3.1 seconds. 2.9 seconds. The skepticism faded. By the end of the first day, 3 loaders had matched his times. By the end of the week, the average reload speed in the training group had dropped from 6.8 seconds to 4.1 seconds. Word spread. Other units requested training. Danny traveled from depot to depot, tank to tank, crew to crew. He taught mechanics, supply clerks, infantrymen who had been reassigned to armor. Anyone who would listen. The results were undeniable. Units that adopted the Kowalski technique reported significant improvements in combat effectiveness. Kill ratios increased. Casualties decreased. Tank crews that had expected to die started expecting to survive. By August 1944, the technique was being taught at every armored training facility in the European theater. The Ordnance Department began studying ways to redesign ammunition racks to support the new loading method. The manual that Colonel Webb had helped write was being revised. Danny Kowalski, the grocery clerk from Pittsburgh, had changed American tank doctrine. But success brought new problems. The technique was spreading fast. Maybe too fast. Reports were being filed. Statistics were being compiled. And somewhere across the lines, German intelligence officers were starting to notice that American Shermans were shooting faster than they should be. Much faster. By late August 1944, captured German documents revealed something troubling. Wehrmacht intelligence had identified a significant change in American tank engagement patterns. Their reports noted that U.S. armored units were achieving fire rates previously thought impossible for Sherman crews. They were investigating, they were adapting, and they were developing countermeasures. The advantage that Danny Kowalski had created was no longer a secret. The Germans knew something had changed. They just didn't know exactly what yet, but they were determined to find out. And when they did, the entire dynamic of armored warfare on the Western Front would shift once again. In Part 3, we will see the German response. New tactics, new weapons, new strategies designed specifically to counter the American speed advantage. The hunters were about to become the hunted. And Danny Kowalski would find himself facing a challenge far more dangerous than any panzer, because the enemy he was about to confront wasn't a tank. It was an idea, and ideas are much harder to kill. In Part 1, Danny Kowalski reorganized his Sherman's ammunition and achieved the impossible. 13 kills in 12 minutes. A reload time that defied every Army manual ever written. In Part 2, he fought a different kind of battle. Not against German tanks, but against American bureaucracy. Colonels who said his technique was dangerous. Generals who said doctrine couldn't change. He proved them wrong. By August 1944, The Kowalski technique was being taught across the entire European theater. American tank crews were shooting faster than ever before. Kill ratios were climbing. Casualties were dropping. It seemed like victory was inevitable. But war has a way of punishing overconfidence. Because while Danny was teaching American loaders how to shoot faster, German intelligence officers were asking a very uncomfortable question. Why are American tanks suddenly so much more effective? And when they found the answer, they didn't just adapt. They evolved. By September 1944, the Wehrmacht had developed countermeasures that would turn the Kowalski advantage into a deadly trap. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The first indication that something had changed came on September 3, 1944, near the Belgian town of Mons. A platoon of 4 Shermans from the 3rd Armored Division engaged a German rearguard position. Standard engagement. Nothing unusual. The American crews had all been trained in the Kowalski technique. Their reload times averaged 3.4 seconds. They should have dominated. They didn't. The Germans had changed their tactics. Instead of standing and fighting, the panzer crews fired once and immediately reversed into cover. They didn't try to win the engagement. They tried to survive it, draw the Americans in, force them to advance, lead them into kill zones where pre-positioned anti-tank guns waited with overlapping fields of fire. 3 of the 4 Shermans were destroyed. The 4th escaped only because its driver threw a track trying to reverse. The after-action report noted something disturbing. The German crews seemed to know exactly how fast the American tanks could fire. They timed their movements to exploit the gaps between shots. Someone had told them. German intelligence had been busy. Captured American tankers had been interrogated about the new loading techniques. Technical manuals had been recovered from destroyed vehicles. By late August, Wehrmacht armored commanders had received detailed briefings on the Kowalski method. They knew the reload times. They knew the ammunition positioning. They knew everything. General Major Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West, issued new tactical guidelines on September 8th. The document was titled, Countering American Rate of Fire Improvements. It outlined specific countermeasures. First, avoid prolonged engagements. American tanks could now fire twice for every German shot. Standing and trading rounds was suicide. Second, use terrain aggressively. Force Americans to advance into ambush positions. Their speed advantage meant nothing if they drove into a kill zone. Third, target loaders specifically. American rate of fire depended on a single crew member. Kill the loader, and the advantage disappeared. This last point was particularly brutal. German tank commanders were instructed to aim for the loader's hatch whenever possible. Disable the man. Disable the technique. The results were immediate and devastating. In the first 2 weeks of September, American tank losses in the 3rd Army sector increased by 34%. Loader casualties specifically increased by 47%. The Germans had found a weakness, and they were exploiting it ruthlessly. Danny Kowalski heard about the losses while conducting training at a replacement depot near Verdun. The news hit him like a physical blow. His technique was supposed to save lives. Now it was getting people killed. The Germans had turned his advantage into a liability. But the external threat wasn't the only problem he faced. On September 12th, Danny was summoned to a meeting at 3rd Army headquarters. He expected another training assignment. Instead, he walked into an ambush of a different kind. The room was full of officers. Most of them looked angry. At the head of the table sat Colonel Webb, the same Colonel Webb who had tried to shut Danny down back in June. Webb had a folder in front of him. Thick. Official-looking. Private Kowalski Webb began, his voice dripping with false courtesy. We have a problem. The Kowalski technique, as it's being called, has been linked to a significant increase in loader casualties over the past 2 weeks. Danny felt his stomach drop. I've seen the reports, sir. The Germans have adapted their tactics. Exactly, Webb interrupted. They've adapted. Because your technique created a predictable pattern that the enemy has learned to exploit. Your loaders are dying because they're all doing the same thing at the same time. Predictability kills. Danny wanted to argue, but Webb wasn't finished. Furthermore, we've received reports of accidents during training. 3 loaders injured in the past week alone. Burns, lacerations. 1 man lost 2 fingers when a shell slipped during high-speed loading drills. Your technique requires movements that are too fast for inexperienced crews. It's dangerous, it's reckless, and I'm recommending that it be suspended pending a full safety review. The words hung in the air. Suspended. After everything Danny had accomplished, after the lives saved, the kills achieved, the doctrine rewritten. Webb wanted to shut it all down. Sir Danny said carefully, "The technique itself isn't the problem. The Germans adapted because we deployed it too widely without tactical adjustments. We need to vary the approach, not abandon it." Webb shook his head. "That's exactly the kind of improvisation that got us into this mess. The Army doesn't need more innovation, Private. It needs discipline, standardization, procedures that work the same way every time." Danny felt something snap inside him. "Procedures," he said, his voice rising despite himself. "Procedures were getting us killed before I changed anything. 6-second reload times. 47 tanks lost per day. Those were your procedures, Colonel. Those were your standardized results." Webb's face went purple. "You're out of line, Private." Maybe Danny shot back, "But I'm not wrong." The room went silent. Danny knew he had gone too far. Insubordination, disrespect to a superior officer. Webb could have him court-martialed. But before Webb could respond, the door opened. A lieutenant stepped in, looking pale. "Sirs, we've just received word. German armor has broken through near Ericourt. Multiple panzer brigades. Our units are engaged. Heavy casualties. Everyone needs at Combat Command A immediately." The meeting was over, but the crisis was just beginning. The Battle of Ericourt began on September 19, 1944, and would last for 10 days. It was the largest tank battle on the Western Front since Normandy, and it would prove once and for all whether the Kowalski technique was a liability or a lifeline. The German plan was ambitious. 5 panzer brigades, over 200 tanks, would strike the exposed flank of Patton's Third Army near the town of Ericourt in eastern France. The objective was to cut American supply lines and halt the Allied advance toward Germany. The attack came at dawn. Fog blanketed the rolling farmland. Visibility was near zero. Perfect conditions for German armor to close the distance before American guns could engage. Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division was directly in the path of the assault. 75 Shermans against over 200 Panzers and Panthers. The odds were nearly 3 to 1. Danny Kowalski was there. Not as a trainer, as a loader. He had requested reassignment to a frontline unit the day after the confrontation with Webb. If his technique was going to be tested, he wanted to be the one testing it. His Sherman was positioned on a slight rise overlooking a shallow valley. The fog was so thick he could barely see 50 yards. Somewhere out there, German engines rumbled. The first contact came at 0647 hours. A Panther emerged from the fog like a ghost. 75 yards out, point-blank range. The German gun was already traversing. Gunner Panther direct front. Danny's hand moved before the command finished. AP round. Breech closed. Up. The Sherman fired. The round struck the Panther's turret ring. Penetration. The German tank shuddered to a halt. Smoke poured from the hatches. More shapes in the fog. 2 Panzer IVs. A half-track. Infantry running alongside. Targets everywhere. Danny loaded. Fired. Loaded. Fired. His hands were automatic now. 3 years of training compressed into movements that took less than 3 seconds each. The fog was both curse and blessing. It limited visibility, but it also meant the Germans couldn't use their superior range. Every engagement was close quarters. Every shot counted. And at close quarters, rate of fire was everything. By 0700 hours, Danny's tank had destroyed 4 enemy vehicles. But the battle was far from over. The Germans kept coming, wave after wave. The fog began to lift around 800 hours, and suddenly the full scope of the attack became visible. Panzers and Panthers stretched across the valley as far as Danny could see. It looked like the entire Wehrmacht had arrived. American tanks were outnumbered everywhere. But they weren't outgunned. The Kowalski technique spread through Combat Command A like wildfire. Loaders who had trained with Danny matched his rhythm. Those who hadn't watched and learned. The American rate of fire was devastating. German tanks that expected to fire twice before receiving return fire were hit 3 times, 4 times. Crews that tried to advance were cut down before they could close the distance. The fog had neutralized the German range advantage. American speed neutralized everything else. By noon, the German attack had stalled. Burning panzers littered the valley. The 4th Armored Division had lost 11 tanks. The Germans had lost over 50. The second day was worse for the Wehrmacht. They tried again at dawn, this time with better coordination, artillery preparation, infantry support, concentrated armored thrusts at specific points. It didn't matter. American tank crews had adapted too. They varied their reload timing. They changed positions between shots. They used the Kowalski technique as a foundation, not a formula. The Germans couldn't predict them anymore. By September 22nd, German losses exceeded 100 tanks. American losses were under 30. The kill ratio was more than 3-to-1 in favor of the Shermans. On September 25th, the German offensive collapsed. The remaining panzer brigades withdrew eastward, leaving behind wrecked vehicles and abandoned equipment. The Battle of Aricourt was over. The 4th Armored Division had faced impossible odds and won. Danny Kowalski emerged from his Sherman on the morning of September 26th. His hands were burned from hot shell casings. His shoulders ached from 10 days of continuous loading. His ears rang from the constant thunder of the 75mm gun. But he was alive. His crew was alive. And scattered across the valley below were the hulks of 17 German tanks that his hands had helped destroy. News of Aricourt spread quickly. Within days, the battle was being studied at every command level from battalion to army group. The statistics were undeniable. Units trained in the Kowalski technique had achieved kill ratios 40% higher than units using standard doctrine. Loader casualties, which had spiked in early September, dropped by 28% once crews learned to vary their timing and positioning. The technique worked, not as a rigid procedure, but as a flexible foundation that crews could adapt to circumstances. Colonel Webb's safety review was quietly shelved. No one wanted to argue with results like Aricourt. By October 1944, the Kowalski technique was mandatory training for every armored unit in the European theater. The Ordnance Department began redesigning ammunition racks to optimize hand path efficiency. New training manuals incorporated Danny's principles of motion economy and predictive positioning. The grocery clerk from Pittsburgh had revolutionized American tank warfare. German commanders drew their own conclusions from Aricourt. Post-battle analysis revealed that American rate of fire had improved by approximately 45% compared to pre-August engagements. The Wehrmacht's tactical countermeasures had failed. They couldn't outmaneuver speed. They couldn't outlast it. They could only avoid it. From October 1944 onward, German armored doctrine shifted decisively toward defensive operations. Offensive tank actions became rare. When they occurred, they focused on surprise and immediate withdrawal rather than sustained engagement. The psychological impact was equally significant. German tank crews who had once considered Sherman's easy prey now feared them. American tankers who had once expected to die now expected to fight and win. Morale shifted across the entire Western Front. Danny Kowalski received the Silver Star for his actions at Aricourt. The citation mentioned exceptional valor and technical innovation that contributed significantly to the defeat of enemy armored forces. He didn't attend the ceremony. He was too busy training another batch of replacement loaders at a depot near Metz. But even as the accolades accumulated, Danny felt something else. Something he couldn't quite name. He had changed tank warfare. He had saved countless lives. He had proven that a grocery clerk could outthink generals and outlast doctrine. But the faces of the men who had died using his technique still haunted him. The loaders who were targeted because the Germans knew what to look for. The trainees who lost fingers to shells that moved too fast. The crews who burned in tanks that couldn't shoot fast enough despite everything he had taught them. War didn't offer clean victories. Every success carried a cost. Every innovation created new vulnerabilities. Danny understood that now, in a way, he hadn't before. The question that kept him awake at night wasn't whether his technique worked. It was whether the lives saved outweighed the lives lost, and whether anyone would remember the difference when the war was over. By November 1944, the Kowalski technique had been adopted across the entire American armored force. It would remain standard doctrine through the end of the war and beyond. But what happened to the man who created it? What became of Danny Kowalski after the guns fell silent and the world moved on? The answer is more complicated than any training manual could capture, because the war changed Danny in ways that no medal could honor and no history book would record. In Part 4, we will follow Danny from the battlefields of Europe to the quiet streets of Pittsburgh. We will see what happens when a man who learned to kill with his hands tries to learn how to live with them. We will discover the legacy he left behind, not just in tank doctrine, but in the lives of the men he trained and the family he built. And we will learn the final chapter of this story, the chapter that explains why a Sherman tank sits in a museum today with chalk marks still visible on its ammunition racks, and why every loader who sees it knows the name Kowalski. This story has one more chapter, and it's the one that matters most. In Part 1, Danny Kowalski was a grocery clerk from Pittsburgh who reorganized ammunition in a way the Army called stupid. In Part 2, he fought colonels and generals who wanted to shut him down, proving his technique worked through official testing that left observers speechless. In Part 3, we watched American tanks dominate the Battle of Normandy, achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible just months earlier. German armor that once hunted Shermans learned to fear them. The Kowalski technique had changed the war. But throughout this entire journey, we focused on battles, on tactics, on statistics and kill counts. We never stopped to ask the most important question. What happened to Danny Kowalski? What becomes of a man who changes history and then has to live with it? The answer is not what you might expect, because success in war doesn't always translate to peace, and the hands that learned to load shells faster than anyone in history eventually had to learn something much harder: how to stop. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Danny Kowalski was in Czechoslovakia when he heard the news. His unit had pushed deep into enemy territory during the final weeks, chasing retreating Wehrmacht forces through villages that greeted them with flowers and tears. He was 23 years old. He had been in combat for 11 months. He had personally loaded over 2,000 rounds in battle. His hands had helped destroy more than 40 enemy vehicles. He had trained over 300 loaders in the technique that bore his name. And he was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The Army offered him a position at Fort Knox, training instructor, permanent assignment, good pay, a chance to shape the next generation of tank crews. He turned it down. He wanted to go home. He wanted to see his father's store. He wanted to smell bread and coffee instead of cordite and burning metal. He wanted to forget. Danny arrived in Pittsburgh in August 1945. The store on Brereton Street was exactly as he remembered it. Smaller, maybe. The shelves a little emptier. His father had aged 10 years in the 3 Danny had been gone. They embraced in the doorway for a long time without speaking. The neighborhood threw a welcome home party. Someone had made a banner that read, "Our hero Danny," in red, white, and blue letters. Danny smiled and shook hands and accepted congratulations from people who had no idea what he had actually done. How could they? How do you explain to Mrs. Kowalczyk from the bakery that you spent 11 months perfecting the art of killing? That your greatest achievement was figuring out how to load death into a tube 2 seconds faster than anyone else? You don't. You just smile and eat the pierogies and pretend everything is normal. Danny took over the store when his father's health declined in 1947. He married a girl named Margaret from the neighborhood in 1949. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. He coached Little League. He attended church every Sunday. He became exactly what he had been before the war, a grocery clerk from Pittsburgh. Ordinary, invisible. The silver star sat in a drawer in his bedroom. He never wore it. He never talked about the war unless someone asked directly, and even then his answers were short. Vague. He would change the subject to baseball or weather or anything else. Margaret learned not to wake him when he had nightmares. The children learned not to ask why their father sometimes stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. The army sent letters occasionally, invitations to reunions, requests for interviews, offers to consult on new training programs. Danny threw them all away unopened. He wanted nothing to do with tanks or shells or loading techniques. He wanted to sell groceries and watch his children grow and forget that he had ever been anything other than what he was now. But forgetting proved impossible, because while Danny was trying to disappear, his legacy was spreading across the world. The technique he created didn't die with the war. It evolved. It multiplied. It became something far larger than one man could ever contain. The Kowalski technique was officially incorporated into U.S. Army doctrine in 1946. Field Manual 17-12. Tank gunnery was completely rewritten to include principles of hand path optimization and predictive ammunition positioning. Every tank loader in the American military learned Danny's methods, but that was just the beginning. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the technique proved itself again. American tank crews facing North Korean T-34s achieved reload times averaging 3.8 seconds compared to the Soviet-designed tanks' 6.5 seconds. The speed advantage was decisive in dozens of engagements. After Korea, NATO allies requested access to American training materials. The British Army adopted a modified version in 1954. The West German Bundeswehr incorporated similar principles when it reformed in 1955. By 1960, every major Western military had implemented some variation of the Kowalski method. The technique continued evolving through Vietnam, where the M48 Patton tanks used updated loading procedures based on Danny's original insights. It influenced the design of the M1 Abrams, America's main battle tank since 1980. The Abrams features an automated loading system for its 120 mm main gun, but the backup manual loading procedures still incorporate Kowalski principles. Even modern tank designs that use autoloaders owe something to Danny's work. The efficiency studies he conducted with his chalk marks and stopwatch became the foundation for ergonomic analysis in armored vehicle design worldwide. The numbers tell the story better than words. Between 1944 and 1945, the Kowalski technique was credited with improving American tank engagement success rates by 34%. Estimated lives saved during World War II alone exceeded 4,000 tankers who would have died using slower reload methods. Over the following decades, as the technique spread globally, that number multiplied. Conservative estimates suggest that Kowalski-derived loading methods have influenced the training of over 2 million tank crew members across more than 40 countries in the past 80 years. The principles Danny discovered didn't stay confined to tanks. His insights about economy of motion and predictive positioning found applications far beyond military use. Industrial engineers studying his technique recognized its broader implications. The concept of arranging tools and materials based on natural hand movements rather than arbitrary organization became a cornerstone of modern ergonomic design. Manufacturing plants reorganized assembly lines using similar logic. Surgical teams optimized instrument placement in operating rooms. Even grocery stores ironically adopted stocking methods that echoed what Danny had learned in his father's shop and perfected in a Sherman turret. The core insight was universal. When seconds matter, the difference between success and failure often comes down to where your hand naturally falls. Design for the human body, not against it. Remove unnecessary movements. Let muscle memory do the work that conscious thought cannot do fast enough. Danny never knew how far his influence spread. He never read the academic papers that cited his technique. He never visited the military schools that taught his methods. He stayed in Pittsburgh selling groceries, raising children, trying to live a normal life. But his legacy was everywhere. In every tank crew that loaded faster. In every factory worker who reached for a tool that was exactly where their hand expected it to be. In every small optimization that saved a second, saved a motion, saved a life. That influence continues today, 8 decades after a skinny kid from Polish Hill drew chalk marks on ammunition racks in Normandy. What can we learn from Danny Kowalski? The obvious lesson is about innovation. Good ideas can come from anywhere. A grocery clerk with no engineering degree revolutionized tank warfare. A man whose only qualification was stocking shelves faster than anyone in Pittsburgh taught the United States Army something its experts had missed for years. This happens more often than institutions like to admit. The people closest to a problem often see solutions that distant experts cannot imagine. Danny understood loading because he did it. He felt the awkward reach across his body. He noticed the wasted seconds. He didn't need a degree to recognize inefficiency. He needed only his hands and his attention. But there's a deeper lesson here about institutional resistance. Why did the Army reject Danny's technique initially? Colonel Webb wasn't stupid. He wasn't malicious. He genuinely believed that doctrine and standardization were more important than individual innovation. And in many contexts, he was right. Armies depend on consistency. They need procedures that work the same way every time, regardless of who performs them. The danger of innovation is unpredictability. What works brilliantly for one person might fail catastrophically for another. The tension between standardization and innovation is eternal. Every organization faces it. Every institution must balance the safety of proven methods against the potential of untested ideas. The Army eventually found that balance with the Kowalski technique. They didn't abandon doctrine. They rewrote it. They took an individual innovation and systematized it, making it teachable, repeatable, scalable. That's the real achievement. Not just having a good idea, but transforming that idea into something larger than yourself. History is full of similar stories. Percy Spencer, a self-taught engineer with no college degree, invented the microwave oven after noticing that radar waves melted a chocolate bar in his pocket. Clarence Birdseye, a naturalist, revolutionized the frozen food industry by observing how Inuit people preserved fish. Charles Goodyear discovered vulcanized rubber through years of failed experiments that everyone around him considered insane. In each case, someone outside the established expertise saw something the experts missed. In each case, institutions initially resisted. In each case, persistence and proof eventually overcame skepticism. Danny Kowalski belongs in that company, not because he was a genius. He would have laughed at the suggestion. But because he had the courage to trust what his hands told him, even when colonels and generals said he was wrong. There's one more detail about Danny Kowalski that almost no one knows. A detail that wasn't discovered until 2019, when the National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Moore, Georgia, conducted a detailed restoration of Sherman tank hull, number 2031489. The same tank Danny loaded during the Battle of Normandy. The same tank that now sits in their collection as a memorial to American armored warfare. During the restoration, a museum conservator named Patricia Hernandez was documenting the interior. She photographed every surface, every mark, every modification. When she reached the ammunition racks, she found Danny's chalk lines still faintly visible after 75 years. But she found something else too. Hidden behind a welded bracket near the loader's station, someone had scratched words into the metal. The scratches were shallow, barely visible, clearly made with a small tool like a screwdriver or a piece of shrapnel. The words read, "For Pop, PFCDK, 1944. Danny had dedicated his innovation to his father, the man who taught him to stock shelves, the man who showed him that efficiency was a form of respect, that doing something faster wasn't about laziness. It was about caring enough to remove the obstacles between yourself and the people you served. Joseph Kowalski died in 1958. His son never told him about the dedication scratched into that Sherman's turret. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he didn't think it mattered. Maybe he just wanted to keep something private in a life that the Army kept trying to claim for history. But the dedication survived. It outlasted both men. It remains there today, visible to anyone who knows where to look. A son's tribute to his father, hidden inside a weapon of war. Danny Kowalski passed away in 1997 at the age of 75. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned that he was a veteran and a longtime business owner. It did not mention the Silver Star. It did not mention the technique that bore his name. It did not mention that his hands had helped change the course of armored warfare forever. He would have wanted it that way. From a corner store in Polish Hill to the battlefields of Normandy, from chalk marks on ammunition racks to doctrines taught in military academies across 40 countries, from a technique called stupid to a method that saved thousands of lives. Danny Kowalski never set out to change history. He just wanted to survive. He just wanted his crew to come home. He just wanted to do his job a little bit better than the manual said it could be done. And in doing so, he proved something that every institution needs to remember. The next world-changing idea might come from the person you least expect. The grocery clerk, the machinist, the private who arranges his footlocker like a store display. Innovation doesn't care about rank or credentials. It cares about observation, courage, and the willingness to be called crazy by people who haven't seen what you've seen. Today, if you visit the National Armor and Cavalry Museum, you can see Sherman 2031-489. The scorch marks are still visible on the turret. The chalk lines have been preserved under protective coating. And if you ask the docents nicely, they might show you the hidden dedication behind the loader's bracket. 4 words scratched into steel 80 years ago. For Pop. A reminder that behind every innovation, every technique, every doctrine, there's a human being. Someone with a family. Someone with fears. Someone who did something extraordinary and then spent the rest of their life trying to be ordinary again. Danny Kowalski was that person, and this was his story. If you know another forgotten hero from World War II, someone whose crazy idea changed everything, share their story in the comments. History remembers the generals and the admirals. But the wars were won by people like Danny. Ordinary people who did extraordinary things and then went home and never spoke of them again. Subscribe to discover more of these hidden stories. Because the best lessons from history aren't in the textbooks. They're in the details that almost got lost. The chalk marks, the scratched dedications, the quiet courage of people who changed the world and never asked for credit. Sometimes the most important innovations don't come from laboratories or boardrooms. They come from a pair of fast hands, a stubborn mind, and the simple refusal to accept that the way things have always been done is the way they have to be done forever.